Imagine walking into a small-town diner for a simple meal, only to be told, "We don't serve your kind." That's exactly what happened to J.D. Vance. But instead of fighting back or walking away, he did something that left everyone in total silence. Stay tuned, because this moment might just change how we handle conflict forever. J.D. Vance eased his rental car into a mostly empty parking lot on the edge of Mapleton, Ohio. The neon sign above Betty's Diner flickered in and out, lighting up a row of empty spaces with a tired pink glow. It was late, the highway silent except for the occasional rush of 18-wheelers in the distance. The day had been long, a whirlwind of public forums, radio interviews, and brief strategy meetings. All he wanted now was a slice of pie, a cup of strong coffee, and a moment to breathe. As he slid out of the driver's seat, the air smelled faintly of rain on hot pavement. Crickets chirped in the tall grass at the lot's edges. The wide windows of Betty's Diner revealed a modest interior, vinyl booths, faded wallpaper, and a handful of customers scattered across the room. It was the sort of place people seldom noticed on a map but never forgot if they visited. J.D. took one last glance at the diner's sign, which sputtered half-heartedly against the night sky, then pushed open the door and stepped inside. He heard the small bell chime overhead. For a moment, no one looked up, but soon enough, heads began to turn, recognition sparking in at least a couple of pairs of eyes. The hush that followed was more than just the stillness of a near-empty diner. It was the hush of people taking stock, trying to decide if they should greet him or turn him away. The air smelled of warm pie crust and cheap coffee, a deceptively welcoming aroma. J.D. felt the faintest prickle along his neck. Something was off. A waitress, her name tag read Rita, caught sight of J.D., and her practiced smile faded a notch. She looked him over with a conflicted expression, as though her training told her to be polite, but her instincts insisted otherwise. Her eyes flicked toward two customers at the counter, an older man in a grease-stained work jacket and a younger man wearing a crisp baseball cap. Both seemed keenly aware of J.D.'s presence. For a beat, Rita just stood there, towel in hand, lips pursed. Finally, she managed, "Welcome to Betty's. Grab a seat wherever you like." The words sounded hollow, and she looked away almost immediately. J.D. inhaled, letting the tension roll past him. He hadn't expected a royal welcome. Not here, not at this hour. But the chill in the air still surprised him. This wasn't ordinary political wariness. There was a layer of resentment. He couldn't quite name it, but it hung around the diner like the ghost of a bad argument. He picked a booth by the window. The vinyl seat squeaked under his weight. Outside, the neon sign flickered again, painting pinkish stripes across his table. He glanced at the menu propped by the napkin holder, but before he could read the daily specials, Rita approached with an apologetic look. Sir, could you hang on for just a minute? I need to check something." J.D. smiled softly. "Sure," he said. "Take your time." But she was gone before he finished speaking, disappearing through the swinging door to the kitchen. And with that, the quiet in the diner became something else, like a held breath, waiting to be released. Sitting there, J.D. couldn't ignore the muffled voices filtering through the crack of the kitchen door. Pots clanged, and occasionally a hiss of steam punctuated the conversation. But what struck him was the distinct rise and fall of words he couldn't quite catch. Someone was unhappy, maybe more than one someone. He took a moment to observe the other patrons. There was Hank, the older man at the counter with the worn work jacket. He had the look of a man who'd done the same job for decades, his calloused hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. He flicked J.D. an uneasy glance, then returned to staring at his reflection in the diner's chrome napkin dispenser. Further down, Caitlin, a weary-looking mom, tried to calm her toddler who was fussing with a crayon. She locked eyes with J.D. for a split second, then quickly looked away. It wasn't fear in her gaze, more like exhaustion, maybe a hint of worry. At the far end of the counter sat Brian, in his early 30s, wearing that crisp baseball cap. He was hunched over a plate of fries, jaw clenched. From time to time, he glanced at the kitchen door with an expression that J.D. could only read as anticipation, like he was waiting for someone to do something dramatic. J.D.'s gaze fell to the coffee cups on the nearby tables, some half-finished, some cold and untouched. A place that smelled so good shouldn't feel so tense. He tried to block the negative energy by looking out at the night sky beyond the window, but the reflection of the diner's lights trapped him in the moment. The clank of pots behind the door grew louder, and he caught a single distinct phrase. He has to go. When Rita finally emerged, she no longer wore even a semblance of a smile. Her shoulders were rigid, and she avoided eye contact with JD. A hush fell across the diner, a hush deeper than before, thick like humidity in July. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "but we can't serve you tonight." The words hung there, each one a separate accusation. JD blinked. He'd been bracing for something along these lines, but hearing it out loud still stung. He'd been turned away in subtle ways, cold shoulders, curt remarks, but never so openly, so deliberately. The hush in the diner became absolute. Even the sizzle of a fryer in the back seemed distant. JD exhaled slowly, keeping his composure. "I don't mean to cause trouble," he said. "Did I break any rules? Or?" Rita pressed her lips together, shook her head. "It's just, well, we'd rather not serve you," she managed, her voice taut. She looked over her shoulder as though seeking backup from the kitchen. "We'd appreciate it if you left." He considered leaving. A part of him wanted to stand up, quietly exit, and never look back. But another part of him, that same part that remembered diners like this from childhood, compelled him to stay. This was a place for everyday folks, people he claimed to represent. If he ran now, the divide would only widen. JD took a measured breath, hands flat on the table to steady himself. "Can I speak with the manager, please?" Rita flinched at the question. She glanced around the diner, where every face was turned toward them in silent fascination. Hank at the counter set his mug down with a slight rattle. Caitlin paused in wiping her toddler's mouth, her eyes flickering with sympathy or curiosity, maybe both. Brian scowled openly, like he wanted JD gone. I'll get him," Rita said, then hurried off to the back. Seconds stretched. JD folded his arms, telling himself to remain calm. He reminded himself that these were the people who felt forgotten, who believed politicians talked a big game and delivered nothing. He couldn't entirely blame them for their anger. At last, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s pushed through the swinging door, arms folded tightly across a grease-stained apron. He wore a name tag that read, Max. His eyes flicked over JD. "You're the one wanting to talk?" he said. His tone wasn't exactly welcoming, but it wasn't overtly hostile either. More like he was bracing for a confrontation he'd prefer to avoid. "I'd just like to know why you won't serve me," JD replied, fighting to keep any trace of frustration from his voice. Max glanced around the diner. All eyes were on them, the tension heavy like a thundercloud about to burst. Max shifted his weight, crossing one thick forearm over the other. "Look," he began, keeping his voice low. "Folks around here aren't exactly fans of politicians. They're even less fans of you." JD swallowed. "I understand people's frustration, I do. But turning me away, does that help anything?" Before Max could answer, Brian from the counter let out a harsh laugh. "He's just here for a photo op," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "That's all you are, right? A big shot who wants to say he mingles with real folks so you can brag about it at some fancy fundraiser." JD turned to Brian, noticing the set of the man's jaw, the tightness around his eyes. He didn't look like someone eager to cause trouble for the fun of it, more like someone who'd been hurt and the scar hadn't healed. "I'm here because I was hungry," JD said simply. "I didn't come in with a camera crew or press. I'm off the clock." Brian sneered. "People like you are never off the clock." He stabbed at a fry, refusing to look away. Max cleared his throat, drawing back JD's attention. "I run a small business," the manager said. "I got people in this town who rely on me for their livelihood. If serving you's gonna stir up trouble, maybe it's safer if you just go." That quiet hush returned. JD felt the weight of every gaze. He took a glance around the diner, meeting the uncertain eyes of Hank and the timid glance from Caitlin. In a voice tinged with weariness, Hank spoke up. "We don't trust politicians because none of them ever come back after they ask for our votes. They show up, they promise, they vanish. Then we're left here cleaning up the mess." Caitlin gently patted her child's hair. You say you care about families, but schools here are falling apart, and nobody does a thing. We send letters, we protest. No one listens. Brian set down his fork with a clang. You'll never fix nothing. Nobody does. Their voices carried a deep, collective pain. JD let their accusations hang in the air without interrupting. Instead of a typical politician's defense, he simply nodded, absorbing the anger, the sorrow. I hear you, he said softly. I do. Max eyed him, arms still crossed. Do you really? Or is that just another line? JD could feel an urge to counter with policy points, to detail his efforts. But the heartbreak in the room demanded something else. Empathy, not rhetoric. I've made mistakes, he admitted, and I've seen the results of broken promises. But I didn't come in here to campaign. I came here because I'm a person, and I thought I could grab a bite like anyone else. If you don't want me here, I can leave. But I wish you'd tell me what makes you so sure I deserve to be shut out in the first place. The moment stretched out. JD drew a slow breath. In the hush, he recalled an old memory, sitting in a diner, not unlike this one when he was still a teenager. The building had since closed, but the feeling of chipped mugs and the distant ring of a jukebox still lingered in his mind. I grew up in a place that felt forgotten, he said, letting a sliver of his personal story slip through. Watched friends' families uproot and leave when factories closed. Saw people struggle with addiction, with dead-end jobs or no jobs at all. I remember the anger, the hopelessness. When I stepped into politics, I wanted to fight for those folks. Folks like me. He paused, aware of how naive it might sound. But it was true. Some days I wonder if the system's bigger than anything one person can fix. But I still try. Because if I don't try, then all that talk about helping people is worthless. Brian's mouth twitched, a reflex caught between scoffing and listening. Max looked at the floor, scuffing his boot against a loose tile. Even Hank's gaze softened, just a little. Words are cheap, Brian finally said, but his voice no longer held the same bite. JD let the silence expand. He wanted them to feel the sincerity of his statement without the usual political fanfare. Outside, the neon sign popped and crackled, casting flickers of light across the laminate tables. Max shifted his stance, exhaling through his nose. You gotta understand, he said, this community's been burned so many times. Last year, a candidate waltzed in, took photos, promised big reforms for Mapleton, then vanished. Months later, we hear the factory's still shutting down, folks still out of work. Rita, who'd been lingering near the kitchen door, piped up. We all know each other here. When somebody hurts one of us, it hurts us all. JD nodded. He could see the lines of tension in their faces, the cumulative toll of betrayal by those in power. I'm not asking you to forget that pain, JD said. I'm just asking for a chance to show you I'm not the same as whoever lied to you. A flicker of doubt crossed Max's features. He glanced at Brian, whose expression was locked in a stubborn frown, then at Hank, who seemed lost in thought. The question was clear. If he gave JD that chance, would the community see it as a betrayal or a willingness to move forward? The silence was thick, the quiet broken only by the hum of the diner's outdated lights. JD decided to make his move. He gently scooted back his chair, stood up, and walked to an empty table near the center of the diner, right where everyone could see him. Then he pulled out a chair and sat down again. I'm not leaving, he said, his voice calm. But I'm not demanding anything either. If you want me gone, say the word and I'll go. But I'd rather stay and talk. Nobody spoke. Even the toddler that Caitlin held had gone strangely silent, as though sensing the shift in energy. The smell of sizzling onions came from the kitchen, and for a moment, it felt like time had paused between the ding of the diner door and the next breath. Finally, Max heaved a long sigh. Talk, he echoed. He ran a hand over his graying hair, turned to Rita, and jerked his head in JD's direction. She looked unsure but took a small step forward. Coffee? She asked, almost in a whisper. JD nodded, a gentle smile crossing his face. Please. Brian tossed his napkin on the counter. Max, he warned, but he didn't finish the sentence. Whatever anger he carried, he wasn't ready to push it into a brawl. It seemed the diner had collectively decided to hear JD out, if only to see if he'd stumble. Rita brought JD a cup of coffee, the steam swirling in gentle spirals. He thanked her quietly. Across the diner, Max still stood with arms folded, as though guarding the boundary between JD and the rest of the place. "So," JD ventured, "tell me about Mapleton. Tell me about what's really going on here." Hank cleared his throat. "We had a small manufacturing plant that employed half the town. They've been shipping jobs overseas for a while now. Wages stagnated. Crime's up. Young people leave as soon as they can." Caitlin nodded. "Schools are underfunded. My oldest can't get the resources he needs for a reading disability. I don't know how to give him a better shot at life." Brian stared into his plate, saying nothing. But the tension in his posture told JD that he'd felt every word. Maybe he had a personal stake. Family members who lost jobs, or a dream that died when the plant shut down. JD listened carefully, occasionally sipping his coffee. He didn't make excuses. He didn't leap in with a half-baked promise. He just absorbed their stories, offering small gestures of acknowledgement. After a few minutes, the once hostile air thinned enough for Rita to step in again. "Would you like anything to eat?" she asked, uncertain but not unkind. JD nodded, grateful for the olive branch. "What do you recommend?" She gave a hint of a grin. "Our meatloaf's famous around here." When the plate arrived, JD took a careful bite. "That's pretty damn good," he said, swallowing a warm mouthful of savory sauce and tender meatloaf. A subtle wave of relief rippled through the room, as if they all realized that sharing a meal was less threatening than a confrontation. Max finally uncrossed his arms. "Look," he began, "I'm not saying we're all good now, but I can see you're at least listening. We don't get that often." JD set down his fork. "I understand," he said. "Trust isn't rebuilt in one night." He glanced around, meeting everyone's eyes, including Brian's. "I'm not perfect, but I'll do what I can. And if you ever want to talk more, I'll be back. Not with cameras, not for a press event, just me." A few patrons shifted in their seats, as though the gravity in the room had somehow changed. Hank finished his coffee, then gave JD a small nod, a gesture that felt like cautious respect. Caitlin managed a tired smile while gathering her child's crayons. Even Brian, though he didn't smile, seemed less tense. JD finished his meal, paid his bill, and stood. Rita handed him a slip of paper. It listed the diner's phone number. "In case you really do come back," she said quietly. Max walked JD to the door, pulling it open with a firm tug. The neon sign outside had mostly burned out, leaving only a faint glow at the bottom of the letters. "Folks'll talk about this," Max warned. "Some won't like that I let you stay." JD tipped his head in gratitude. "I appreciate you taking the risk." He stepped into the parking lot, the night air cooler than before. A slight drizzle had started, tapping against the asphalt. JD glanced back at the windows of Betty's diner. The customers had returned to their meals and conversations, but the tension of earlier was replaced by something else. Maybe not acceptance, but a willingness to leave doors open rather than slam them shut. He took a deep breath, unlocking his car. With a final look at the dim pink glow of the diner's sign, he pulled onto the highway and disappeared into the night, reflections of passing headlights glinting off his windshield. If you made it to the end of this story, I have one question for you. Have you ever found yourself at a crossroads where walking away seemed easier, but staying to talk might actually change something? It's not always comfortable. It often hurts to stand your ground when every instinct says to get out, but sometimes that's the only moment real understanding begins. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know if you would have done the same as JD or left the diner without a second glance. And if you found any value in this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap that notification bell to stay in the loop. There's always another story to tell, and I'll be here, ready to share it. Until next time, stay curious, because sometimes the most important conversations happen when you dare to stay instead of walk away.